Hi, this short animation is for the University of Tasmania Managerial Social Responsibility students to help you apply the ethical theories you have studied in this course to an ethical dilemma. Now, we have studied two broad categories of ethical theory: teleological, where the rightness of an action is determined solely by the consequences and not the intention of the action, and deontological, meaning prior to action, and we decided if an act is ethical or unethical without considering the consequences. Deontological theories are motivated by reason alone. Universal ethical imperatives. Reason tells us that something is always right. All can follow the ethical reasoning without contradiction. Now, under teleological, we studied utilitarianism, theorized by Jeremy Bentham of the 18th and 19th centuries. The aim of utilitarianism is to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number affected by a decision or action. How do we do this? Well, we assess all the consequences on all those affected by the decision in the short and long run. The key words in the theory are the ends justifies the means. Applying utilitarianism to an ethical dilemma is easy enough. Imagine all the possible consequences of each decision after the decision point, accept that if they can happen, they will happen, and weigh up which decision creates the greatest good and the least harm for the greatest number. Most students do not struggle with this. Under Deontological, we studied Kantianism or Kantian ethics, theorized by philosopher Immanuel Kant of the 18th century. Ethical rights theory, or what we have simply called rights theory. Now, we didn't study the origins of this theory, but it was the oldest theory we studied. While we see it manifested in places like the United States Declaration of Independence and the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, the modern version of the theory is attributed to John Locke of the 17th century, although it has links back to Plato's virtue ethics of the 4th century, although these details are not important for you in studying this subject. And finally, distributive justice, or what we have simply called justice theory. Again, we didn't go into depth of the origins of this theory, but it is the youngest theory we studied, posited by John Rawls in the 20th century. For the mechanics of these theories, we go to new slides. Now we turn to our deontological theories, which, remember, were concerned with the rightness or wrongness of our actions regardless of the consequences. Firstly, we considered Kantianism. Kant emphasized the way in which an ethical life is centered on duty. There are some things we ought to do and some things we ought not to do. Duties, or maxims, as they were also called, are internally imposed and not concerned with following orders or feelings or other inclinations. Actions are taken in obedience to these maxims without regard for any consequences that follow. Maxims are subjective rules that guide action. We define who it is that we owe our primary duty to in each particular ethical dilemma. We make sure the maxim is expressed as a rule that all others could follow in similar circumstances. So when we apply this theory to an ethical dilemma, we ask, to whom do I owe my primary duty? This will normally be the person or persons that are most disadvantaged or disrespected at the decision point. That is, besides you, the decision maker. What maxims are in play? Is there a prima facie case for a particular maxim? That is there an obvious choice that it is difficult to argue against? But importantly for this unit, if you feel there is an obvious maxim, you still need to show your logic and reasoning in determining that it was an obvious maxim. Remember, for each maxim there is at least two alternatives. For instance, to always do X or to never do X. Which maxim passes the categorical imperative test? Is it universalizable? Does it respect others, specifically the person to whom we owe a primary duty? Does it respect others' autonomy? Specifically, my intent cannot be to use others. I must respect them as autonomous beings themselves. A maxim must pass all these tests in order to fit the categorical imperative. Do you notice we haven't discussed what is going to happen down the track, the consequences of this decision? We are simply concerned with the treatment of the one to whom we owe our primary duty. Next, we studied ethical rights theory, or simply rights theory. So a right is something that I am entitled to if I want it, in which enables me to act on my own and be treated by others in a certain way without asking permission. An ethical right does not exist unless there is an obligation attached to it. So negative rights impose obligation on others to refrain from acting in any way that would deprive me of that right. So my negative right to life means that others should not take my life. My negative right to autonomy, remembering autonomy is about being able to self-determine, means others should not take my autonomy away from me. Positive rights impose obligation on others to act positively on my behalf so that I can access that right. For instance, the positive right to education, which obligates all other rational beings to educate them. The United Nations Declaration on Human Rights declares the right of a child to an education. Ethical rights are prioritized according to a hierarchy of importance. The claim of a negative right to life is considered most important and is located at the top of the hierarchy. The negative right to safety is arguably the next most important, the negative right to privacy after that, etc. A tip here, no right, however important, is absolute. Your negative right to life cannot be the most important right if you're attempting to murder someone else. Hence, in our law system, the self-defense argument if you happen to kill somebody when defending yourself. Similarly, your negative right to free speech does not extend to shouting fire in a crowded venue where there is no fire. In applying rights theory, we define the ethical dilemma. What rights are at play, given your set of possible actions? Now, these are rights at play at the time of the ethical dilemma, not further down the track. If you think your decision sets off a chain of events that will eventually violate the rights of someone else, that is a consequence and not a consideration for you in your ethical decision. Their rights are not in play at the time of the ethical dilemma. Do any of the rights identified clash? Tip: you must always assume that every right that could be claimed will be claimed in your analysis, unless you have evidence to the contrary. Which right is the most basic according to the hierarchy of rights? This right prevails. Tip: if no rights are clashing, the theory states that the decision maker may choose either dilemma option. Finally, we considered distributive justice theory, or simply justice theory. John Rawls posited that each person is to have equal right to the most extensive basic liberty, compatible with similar liberty for others, and that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all. So justice is providing everyone in society their due, while simultaneously treating equals equally and unequals unequally. An example here is in providing disabled parking spaces. We are making the unequal equal by treating them unequally. We have created a situation that gives them an equal opportunity that someone with a disability doesn't need. The difficulty is the human tendency to make decisions that favour ourselves. So unless we are currently disadvantaged, our decision may further disadvantage the already disadvantaged. So Rawls said we have to make our decision behind a veil of ignorance. Rawls said rational beings are respectful, or should be respectful, of all other rational beings. Rational beings are utility maximizers that value their own good and the good of others. But because we don't know if we are the worst off, we have to imagine that we don't know whether we are the worst off and make the decision that benefits the worst off at the time of the decision. The decision maker must have an understanding of the status quo for all the relevant parties in the ethical dilemma situation. The decision maker must have a list of those parties that may be the worst off at the time of the decision, not after the decision. The decision maker must have a definition of why the parties may be the worst off. Also, the decision maker must then identify one party who is the worst off. The decision maker then assumes that that party is the worst off, and then the decision maker will choose the option that improves the outcome for that worst off party. So now it is time to apply all these theories to an ethical dilemma case study. Firstly, we list all the case facts. List all the significant factors in the case that define the situation. Next, you define the case issues. Here you should be narrowing down to the specific issues that are putting the decision maker in the ethical dilemma. Here you should also be naming the decision maker, either by name or position in the organisation. Next, you define the ethical dilemma. The dilemma should be simply stated, either do X or do not do X. It should also include the punishments for each choice for the decision maker. So the decision point is what is causing the most difficulty for most students. What do I consider in making my decisions? The teleological theory of utilitarianism considers the short and long-term consequences of the decision. The deontological theories only consider the issues at the time of the decision, not after the decision point. So Kantianism considers at the time of the decision who is owed the primary duty and what maxim. Rights considers at the time of the decision whose rights are clashing and whose is higher on the hierarchy. Justice considers at the time of the decision who is worst off, and the decision is made that will improve the situation for the worst off. This is at the time the decision is to be made. It is what causes most difficulties for most students with deontological theories. For instance, we had several case studies this semester that involved planes. Students wanted to consider the safety of passengers, but at the time of the ethical dilemma, the planes were not for sale, so the passengers were not yet a consideration. It is hoped that this animation assists you in coming to grips with this unit in the lead up to the exam.